Now, the idea of a strict personal moral code based on an unchanging set of universal rules is seen by many as old-fashioned and Victorian. Yet most of us retain the desire to be a good person, and morality is often cited to support political and cultural opinions and actions. So is this a hypocrisy designed to make us look good, but avoiding having to change our own behaviour? If we're to make use of the notion of morality, must we see morality as a universal set of rules or law that applies to all in all circumstances? Or can we endorse a personal morality that's sustained by the consistency and integrity of the individual to give it force and value? Well, fascinating topic, and we've got three really interesting speakers here to debate it. First of all, Jesse Norman is a Treasury Minister, but he's here because he's a keen political philosopher and author of Compassionate Conservatism, as well as biographies of Adam Smith and Edmund Burke. Julie Bindel is a radical feminist writer and co-founder of the law reform group Justice for Women, which helps women who've been prosecuted for killing violent male partners. And Jonathan Wolfe, who's known as Joe, is a moral philosopher at Oxford University. He's developing a research programme on revitalising democracy and civil society, and his work largely concerns equality, social justice, and poverty. So as usual, I'm going to ask each of the three to do a 3-minute pitch on the question of, is it hypocritical to believe that other cultures have different moralities and yet think that we can be objectively good? Jesse Norman first.
I think from a purely philosophical perspective, the answer to your question is that there isn't anything hypocritical about believing in universal morality as regards one's own self, which of course may be a belief that's deluded in its own right, and yet thinking that other moralities are in some sense non-universal or partial. And the reason for that is that people can be radically solipsistic. They can just believe that they're right and that their world is the one that, as it were, is the only true world. And we've seen examples in history. The Spanish Inquisition comes to mind, in which people might have taken the view that other people could have local moralities of their own kind, but there was only one morality that really mattered. So that's, I suppose, the overall question. But there's a deeper, in a way, more interesting issue for me, which is, whether there are such things as, or there could be such a thing as a single universal morality. And it's sometimes easy to think that that might be so, because there's so much moralizing and denunciation that seems to go on at the moment on social media and elsewhere. And some of that is directed, as it were, at encouraging people to do the right thing from all the best motives, but quite a lot of it seems to me to be about virtue signaling or advertising one's own prowess. And of course, anyone watching this might think that politicians of all kinds are amongst the worst offenders in this area. So what is it that we think about when we think about universal morality? Well, I would say that it's something which is actually very hard to imagine, not only not existing in this world, and anyone who thinks differently might want to think about the limitations of the best candidates for that, Kantianism or utilitarianism, a philosophy of duties, or a philosophy of, as it were, the best advantage based on the best outcome for the greatest number, or some such hedonic calculus. And so looking at the failure of those and insufficiency of those philosophies, those moralities, points to, I think, a wider idea, which is that actually we all seem to occupy some world that tries to have a local consistency, but draws in on different traditions and different ideas when we have to make concrete judgments. And that, I think, actually is not only the natural human tendency, it's also probably the philosophically speaking, the best description we can give of how people behave in outline, although we can always go deeper. So as the final thought would be, does that mean that our personal moralities are unimprovable? Absolutely not. We can always be thinking about our own practice, thinking about the rules and norms of our society, thinking about the best public policy from a moral perspective that is more demanding, perhaps, than we're used to, in order to test it, in order to see how good it is. And we can apply the same standards to our own lives and try to live better lives ourselves at the same time as well.
Thank you. Okay, Julie Bindel.
Well, I'm interested in the type of cultural relativism as a feminist who campaigns to end male violence against women and girls, where if we're in the West or the global North, looking out at cultures, for example, in the global South, where there's lots of discussion about whether it's judgmental to condemn female genital mutilation, forced or early marriage, and the like. And yet the only culture that's relevant in this discussion, as far as I'm concerned, is patriarchy. So the culture of patriarchy that excuses or even condones and encourages the abuse of women by men in order to uphold that power. But conversely, when morality is discussed within the parameters of sex, and obviously as a feminist, I'm very, very interested in how male sexual behaviour upholds the systems of patriarchy. When morality is discussed, often it's actually in order to condemn the likes of me. We are, those of us that speak out against rape, against harmful sexual practices that are now sold as liberating, such as choking, spitting during sex, other forms of abusive practice, such as coercing women to watch violent pornography and reenact scenes in violent pornography. We're actually seen or labelled as moralists. And what that means is anti-sex Puritan. It's very directly an insult, which then stifles a discussion about what a true moral compass would be, what morality truly is when we look at sex and sexual practice. For example, prostitution, the act of a man, because it usually almost always is a man, paying for access to the inside of a woman's body, because it almost always is a woman, for one-sided sexual pleasure. We're told that we are moralistic if we campaign to end the sex trade and wish to imagine a world without prostitution. And yet, is it really moral to speak about consent when the cash is the consent, when it's clear to that man paying for sex that the woman does not want sex with him or he wouldn't be paying her?
So, isn't it interesting, sorry to interrupt, but isn't it interesting that the word moralistic is actually applied as a criticism, as a sort of derogatory word, whereas it ought to mean being moral?
Absolutely. And is it really moral? I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, Marianne. Is it really moral to think to dehumanize and commodify women to the point of where you can separate orifices to which you pay for access, when it's clear that this is a one-sided arrangement? Similarly, when we speak about sexual morality, well, people then will go back to, for example, Victorian morality, which is supposedly anti-sex. But during that time, for example, between 1880 and 1914, where feminists were speaking about men's sexual behaviour that's harmful to women, those feminists campaigned against the abuse and exploitation of poor women and girls within the sex trade, and also campaigned to end rape in marriage, to criminalise rape in marriage. So to me, I suppose to wrap up, morality, when we think about it in terms of feminism and about the kind of campaigns that feminists that aim to end male violence are involved in, morality has to be about reshaping men's sexual rights and looking at the way that those rights become wrongs when done to women. We have to be able to imagine a world without prostitution, without rape, without male violence, as a moral, ethical and political goal, and a utopian goal, because utopia is underrated. And there's nothing, of course, that is moral in abusing women.
Okay, thank you. Jo Wolfe.
Let me start trying to answer this question by telling you a little bit about my teacher, G.A. Cohen. So he was a Marxist much of his life. He was brought up, in fact, in a Jewish Marxist household in Montreal. And he was very aware that most of his beliefs he got from his mother and his local community. And he said that had he been brought up in a different family, if he'd been brought up in a conservative Catholic family, he probably would have had quite different beliefs. So thank goodness, he said, I was brought up in the right family. Now, in his case, he thought he had the correct moral views, even though he got them from his family, and thought that if he'd been brought up in a different family, he had different views, the wrong ones. So philosophically, I find this such an interesting story because...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.